Well, hello and welcome to this discussion about Sudan. We have here today James Wilson, a journalist and publisher from EU Political Report. We got Anna Wadensky, who has more than 2.5 million views every month on YouTube. And the MEP, Marton Göngyesi. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so the situation in Sudan, of course, is tragic, and I don't think that we will be able to solve the problem today, but we'll just be able to exchange some views. As you know, in April, there was supposed to have been an agreement for a new government, prime minister, and all the other ministers, and it didn't happen because on the 13th of April, the civil war started. And it is very difficult for outsiders to understand what is happening. But I think that maybe we'll ask Martin to start, to explain a little bit. He has an international background. He's been living in Egypt and Iraq and Afghanistan, so he is probably the most knowledgeable about the culture of this in this part of the world.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm not sure how knowledgeable I am about Sudan itself, but I do have some experience from the region, and here in the European Parliament I'm member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I do follow everything that is diplomacy, foreign affairs, and especially in such crises a lot of attention and a lot of focus is put on the region. And I think in understanding Sudan, since its independence and to understand this current conflict, I think we have to go back to the long reign of al-Bashir and the collapse of his regime and the conflicts that have taken place in Sudan in the past couple of years, the conflict in Darfur, in the Darfur region, the reign of al-Bashir and his grip on power and building basically parallel structures within the army and the military. And when we are looking at this conflict, we can see a toppled dictator, al-Bashir, and the fight for power by two strong men who have been in charge of some parts of the military, one of them the official military per se, the other a paramilitary organization which has been called into action during the Darfur crisis. Both of them have their support and their backing from certain regions and from certain segments of the society. It is a power struggle. It is a struggle for power. It is a struggle for resources in a geographically very sensitive place, in a huge country with enormous resources. And of course, as it usually happens in such situations, the situation is complicated by its geopolitical surroundings and environment, where Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, the United States, the European Union, all have a role to play, an outlook and an interest in somehow bringing this whole situation to contain the situation or to aggravate the situation for that matter. So it is a very, very complicated conflict, and it is very, very difficult to understand where this conflict could be developing. But I think there is a window of opportunity now to, before the whole situation escalates, to start peace talks. But it's an extremely difficult situation that we are facing in Sudan.
James, you have been in Brussels since 1986. You've been following wars, unfortunately, in many parts of the world. I know, especially in Ukraine today. What are your views on this?
Well, from the point of view of Europe, of course, we want to see diplomacy find a solution to bring the parties together and resolve the differences. I fully agree with our member here that it's a difficult and sensitive situation when you have two powerful armies squaring off against each other. But Europe's interest is partly self-interest, because the last thing we want to see is an influx of refugees coming across the borders and causing problems within the EU. Potentially there are hundreds of thousands of people who are being displaced. And for the time being, many of them are escaping to Ethiopia, to Chad, or some to the north, to Egypt. So a peaceful diplomatic solution would be desirable. However, unfortunately, the cards would appear to be stacked in favor of generating chaos. We have active within Sudan the mercenary forces of the Wagner paramilitary group, a paramilitary company, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is a close associate of the president of the Russian Federation, Mr. Vladimir Putin. And I ask myself, given the large presence of Russian troops in Sudan, is there any interest on their part to secure a diplomatic and peaceful solution? I have my reservations, and therefore until we have a much clearer and stronger diplomatic initiative, particularly from the African nations. This is, let's face it, one of the biggest countries in Africa, and there must be a stronger involvement of African nations to secure a diplomatic route out of the mess, and of course the other global players.
Of course, especially the neighboring countries are very much concerned, because that's where the refugees will show up.
It's difficult for Ethiopia to get too involved, although they are themselves very strong supporters of the African Union, because they have their own problems at the moment, trying to stabilize the domestic political situation in their country. But perhaps Kenya, South Africa, other nations within Africa can provide a team to bring the two military leaders in Sudan together and broker a ceasefire and a route map to re-establishing a proper civilian government.
What about Egypt? They also have a general as a president.
By all means, yes. It's not for me to dictate who should be sending their diplomats to solve the issue, but they would be a good candidate also, in my opinion.
Anna, how do you look at this?
Well, I think the complexity is that there is no linear conflict. It's not only between two generals that are fighting for power and who are belligerent, because there are a number of conflicts which are intertwined. First of all, we shouldn't skip the fact that Sudan is a country of young people, and they have great frustration about what happened after the revolution, because after that there were years of COVID, of pandemic, when nothing moved. And of course now we see that Biden administration is trying to catch up. So they allocated almost 300 million last year for humanitarian needs, but I'm afraid that this came a little bit too late, because the frustration was already there. And also I would like to underline that there is not only struggle between the generals, but also struggle in public opinion, because many young people associate themselves with General Hemeti, which is not Hemeti. Hemeti is Little Muhammad. So it's a lovely name to a man who is associated with a new generation of Sudanese. He comes from a very poor clan, from Darfur. He has no important relatives in the capital, and that speaks a lot to many young people, because they see in him a future Sudan. And so now we can say that there are special forces fighting against army, because it's like people's militia now, because many young people joined Hemeti in this struggle, especially from the west of the country. And so there is a complexity within the society because al-Burhan is seen as very much a figure from the past associated with Omar, which ran from the prison. He escaped lately. Omar escaped. So it's one conflict, but there is the other conflict. It's a bigger conflict between superpowers. Because you mentioned Russia, you mentioned Russian interests, which was there because Lavrov had agreements with both generals. It wasn't one Hemeti or one al-Burhan. He secured the port, the naval port of Russia in Red Sea, which is the most important sea route in the world. It's the most intense. So he secured that position. But there is also huge Chinese interest because Chinese were thinking and planning to construct the pipeline for oil from South Sudan through territory of Sudan to the Red Sea. So you see there are a lot of interest. And of course, lately Americans came. So they came, basically ambassador appeared there September last year. And first thing he said that there should be no Russian naval port. So there was also old good struggle between superpowers in the style of Cold War. There is Chinese factor. There are factors within the society. So they're young and old, and all that adds to complexity. And it's certain symbiosis of conflicts, I think, and that's what makes it so difficult.
Oh, thank you very much. You seem to be very knowledgeable about Sudan. Martin, any comments on this?
I think both aspects were very important to show the complexity, the real complexity and the nature of this conflict that we are dealing with. And indeed, I think what is very worrying, if you are looking at the neighboring countries and the past of the region, under al-Bashir, some of the greatest investments were made by the Chinese. They have developed Port Sudan as a port. They have built out the infrastructure as far as roads, network, mines are concerned. So the Chinese have a decade-long or many decades of economic presence and vested interests in the country. The Russians have been backing the military, both sides, but since one of the sides have denounced Wagner, they seem to be siding with the paramilitary side. And let's not forget the Russian presence in neighboring Libya, already on the side of the Haftar and his militias, which brings a very worrying international or a broader aspect to the whole conflict. And it already shows how this conflict can become even more complicated in the future than it is now. But nonetheless, in every such situation, regardless of how complex the situation is, before the situation escalates, I think it is very important to see how a diplomatic solution and a political solution can be found. I think the odds are not very good, but I think getting the superpowers on the table, a UN Security Council resolution or UN Security Council can be an important player in that. But I couldn't agree more that the European nations and the African nations should be playing a major role in settling the conflict or bringing, get the ball rolling in the diplomatic efforts. And the neighboring countries can play a major role in that.
I think you're right to bring in the Security Council of the UN, because of course we need an international diplomatic solution. But frankly, it's unhelpful if the chairman of the Security Council is using tens of thousands of well-armed troops to find a solution to the conflict, rather than investing in the economics, the business, the diplomacy to find a peaceful route out of this.
Certainly the odds are not good.
Yeah. Anna?
Well, I think that we have to see the larger conflict. First of all, I'm a bit upset about absence of Ursula von der Leyen, because her diplomat, Borrell, should have mounted above all these regional differences and problems. He should be there. And I think that's a big problem, because she declared Africa as a major theme of her mandate. She said she went first to African Union, and why she is so silent. So I think that there is a problem that Europe, as a neutral player, doesn't show much interest. So Borrell said, we're evacuating people, it's wonderful, it's good, but it's not a diplomatic solution. I think there is a lack of European initiative. And of course, we have to deal with the fact that private military companies are reality, because Americans started in Iraq when there was a need to defend a green zone in Baghdad, and then it was Black Waters. They won a contract of 20 million. And I think that is reality, so we have to deal with this reality. We can't expect that Wagner Group will leave Sudan. So we have to accept all this complexity, but I think that Europe is missing the chances. That I see is a big problem, because Ursula von der Leyen is not even outspoken. She could go there, she could go to neighboring countries, she could make an effort. And there is no effort, I don't see it. So Europe is waiting that some mega players as United Nations would take lead. But I think that Europe should and is obliged to be a global player, because that was the obligation towards European citizens.
Now, what would happen if there was an agreement and the ceasefire that was kept and there would be elections? What do you think would be the outcome of that?
Well, I think that it's too early to talk about elections, because I think now the prime goal is to pacify the country. So you can't have elections in the country which is in fire. And what I read today before coming to the studio is that there is no respect for ceasefire. So they are fighting, and the problem is that there is no internet there, it was cut off, there is no telecom, the groups are connected through their own radio systems, etc. So it's very difficult to harmonize the situation, but it's very much needed, because nobody will profit from the civil war. There will be no winners in the civil war, no Russia, no United States, no China. So I think that the major effort is to establish, first of all, ceasefire, and then start peace talks. And it might take a long time, but it's a complex situation. And I think before it turns into Somalia, which is absolute disaster, there can be measures taken to prevent it.
Martin, what is the role of the European Parliament in this? What can we do here?
Well, I couldn't agree more that Europe. This is one of the many chances that Europe is already missing out on to establish itself as a geopolitical player, as Ursula von der Leyen defined her mission back in 2019 when she was elected as president of the Commission. And I know that she's very busy with the conflict next door, Ukraine. But we have already seen, and we could already seen signs of European weakness in the wake of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where Europe was, or the European Union was not very visible either, and it was looking for someone else to solve the conflict, some big regional players or superpowers to play it out. And it is worrying that we have not heard the voice of the European Union in this conflict as yet. And what the European Parliament can do, it does have the instruments of pushing the Commission to get its act together and get its voice heard in the European Parliament. I'm almost certain that it is going to be a hot topic sometime soon. And what the European Parliament can do is put pressure on the Commission and the High Commissioner to unite and get a European position on Sudan and get on the ground and get moving and get acting.
Yes, Anna?
If I may, to continue, I think that is crucial to have cooperation with the African Union, because that was the starting point of Ursula von der Leyen. It was her first foreign trip to African Union, and I think that she should go on developing this cooperation, because African countries, they have a say in this situation, because it's a very turbulent region, and if the other countries around start to catch fire, like now we heard that weapons are delivered from Libya, from Libyan routes, from Sahara Desert, they deliver weapons to different paramilitary groups, because now it's very difficult to define who is supporting who, because it's not as clear as, for example, in Ukraine. So it's a lot of chaos there, and I think that it's crucial that the countries in the region unite, and Ursula von der Leyen plays her role within the African Union. Europe needs to lead, and I'm missing this dimension.
Okay, James, any final comments?
Well, it's very easy to point the finger at Super Borrell and Super von der Leyen and express the hope that they're going to zoom in to rescue the situation as the mediator of last resort. Yes, I would love to see a stronger role for the European Union, but let's not forget who is stirring it and what the strategy of one of the main protagonists is. And I'm referring here again to our friends in Russia, who are present in neighboring Chad, they're present in Libya, they're present in Sudan. And their main interest in terms of the scenario they'd like to see in Sudan is one of chaos. It's in Russia's interest to spread international disputes and chaos so that Europe will be swamped by a flood of refugees, and that we will see situations like we saw in New Year 2015 in Köln in Germany, where ordinary citizens were attacked by hundreds of refugees. This is what Russia is trying to do. So much as I welcome, and I would welcome, a very powerful and strong diplomatic intervention from Europe and the EU, let us not forget what we're up against. We're up against hybrid enemies who are prepared to sow chaos and have no interest in a peaceful solution.
Okay, thank you, James. Anna?
Well, I think Russians called for peace because they wanted to construct this naval base, and they had agreement with both generals, and Lavrov had successful talks. So I think they are also, as Russians as Chinese, they're least interested in this situation. But I think that there was very little effort of international community to pacify, because the superpowers have to accept the fact that Africa is for Africans, and they are Africans who will decide the future of their country, the future of the sport, if they need the sport, yes or no. And of course, I think that the epoch when our outsiders could say their final word is over. But we have to help Africans to pacify, because when there is a peaceful atmosphere, they can vote, they can decide, and I insist that Ursula von der Leyen should play a role, because that was her obligation. She said herself, when she went to African Union, she said that Africa is my priority. So she should show, in reality, she should go there, that Africa is her priority, and they would have to organize a conference on Sudan, as minimum, I think, and I haven't heard it yet.
So you're saying that she's not fulfilling her promises?
Yes, absolutely. I think that she should be very prominent in this situation, because that was her personal obligation. She said that there is no more important political dimension for Europe than Africa. Africa is dimension number one, and it's true, because it's the youngest continent, it's most rapidly developing continent, and it's the most important neighbor of Europe. So I think that aging Europe have to embrace and help the neighbors. And I think that is the only solution, because I love Africa. I think it's a country of opportunities, and unfortunately it's undermined in many ways.
Now, Martin, when you grew up in the neighboring country of Egypt, is this something that you thought that this might happen, this tragic war?
Well, I grew up in a number of crisis zones, and Egypt, Iraq, and Afghanistan probably in the worst times of their recent history. In Iraq, under the Iraq-Iran war, in Afghanistan, at the collapse of the Najibullah regime. I think those were the probably, well, I wouldn't say the most difficult times of these nations, but certainly one of them. And I would have thought that after the end of the Cold War, we will come to some kind of a more peaceful era where in the New World Order things are resolved through diplomacy and through political effort. It is very sad to see countries like Sudan go up in flames through civil conflict or civil wars and such. I mean, it is, we cannot say that it's a regional conflict with all these players involved, with everything at stake. This is, the real danger of this is becoming a global conflict. And just to finish it on a somewhat optimistic note, I think in the last 1 or 2 years, Europe has become an important player. Russian aggression in Ukraine has managed to unite the European Union on the foreign policy front like never before. I think
even with Hungary.
Well, Hungary being an exception, but we are working on getting the Hungarian regime back on track. But Hungary is the exception. But I hope it will also be on board soon. But the European Union, I think, in the last couple of years has learned to play a foreign policy role. It is getting there, although it is much slower than expected and much slower than we would like to see it happen. I think there is an opportunity there, and it is going to happen at the end, but urgency or timing is of the essence.
Well, I think we're hopeful that the atrocities will end as soon as possible. And, well, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.